wealthy man thought he could bully a bleeding stranger in a grocery store. He didn't expect a quiet, exhausted single dad to stand in his way and steal the heart of the woman he was trying to control. The bitter Chicago winter howled through the concrete canyons of the city, carrying a biting wind that seemed to cut right through the fabric of Ethan Cole's frayed, thin coat. At 34, Ethan navigated a life defined by perpetual exhaustion, unforgiving budgets, and a fierce, consuming love for his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie. As they trudged along the icy pavement, Ethan held her small, gloved hand tightly, grounding himself in the warmth of her presence against the brutal chill. Sophie was a deeply observant and remarkably stoic child who rarely complained. She had long ago internalized the heavy, unspoken boundaries of her father's financial struggles after her mother abandoned them 5 years prior. Learning to walk past brightly colored toy displays and candy aisles without making a sound. Their evening routine began its meticulous unraveling during a trip to the local discount grocery store. As the heavy automatic door slid open, swapping the biting winter gale for the damp, metallic scent of melting snow and aging produce, Ethan grabbed a rusted metal shopping cart. Its wheels squealed in protest against the scuffed linoleum, a harsh soundtrack to his internal anxiety. In his calloused palm rested a meager fortune of tarnished pennies and crumpled dollar bills funds he was frantically calculating to afford their absolute basic necessities for the week. Sophie walked close to his side, her observant eyes scanning the environment as they navigated the narrow aisles of canned goods dot in the produce aisle. The damp floor was a treacherous hazard of discarded lettuce leaves and tracked-in gray slush. An elderly man with trembling hands reached hesitantly toward a stack of bruised apples, his frail frame completely unaware of the storm about to hit him. Suddenly, a wealthy man in an expensive, immaculate dark blue wool coat strode sharply down the aisle. His eyes were glued to the illuminated screen of a high-end smartphone. An arrogant scowl plastered across his sharp features. Without looking up, the wealthy man clipped the older man's shoulder with brute force. The sudden, violent impact sent the elderly man crashing hard onto the wet linoleum, a heavy thud echoing over the store's tinny ambient music, while the wealthy man coldly ignored the situation. Simply pausing to brush imaginary dust from his pristine sleeve, the crowd of onlookers froze in shock. But a stranger broke from the paralysis of the bystanders. A young woman, a nurse practitioner named Clara, dropped immediately to the wet floor. The harsh fluorescent lighting illuminated a stark, fresh blue-edged bruise blooming on her left cheekbone, a raw testament to a hidden, violent battle she was fighting behind closed doors. Ignoring her own pain, her movements were clinical and highly competent as she gently checked the dazed elderly man for injuries. Offering a calm, soothing voice amidst the chaos, the store manager rushed over, his face pale with panic. Recognizing the sudden shift in attention, the wealthy man puffed out his chest and sought to control the narrative. He smoothly lied to the staff, his voice dripping with condescension as he claimed the old man had simply slipped on his own clumsiness and that he had nothing to do with the fall. Standing on the periphery, Ethan felt his jaw clench in pure indignation. The sheer audacity of the lie struck a nerve buried deep beneath his exhaustion. He squeezed Sophie's hand gently, offering a silent reassurance, and then stepped forward into the harsh light of the aisle. With a resonant, steady voice that cut cleanly through the wealthy man's bluster, Ethan told the unvarnished truth. He systematically dismantled the arrogant lie, detailing exactly what had happened. In that fleeting moment, despite his empty pockets and weary soul, the struggling single father stood as an immovable shield for the fallen old man and the bruised, brave woman kneeling on the floor. The adrenaline that had surged through Ethan during his confrontation in the grocery store began to evaporate the moment the heavy automatic doors slid shut behind them. In its place, the brutal reality of the Chicago winter slammed into him once again. The temperature had plummeted further during their brief time inside, and the wind howled across the sprawling expanse of the parking lot, whipping flurries of crystalline snow into their faces like tiny, icy needles. Ethan pulled his thin brown coat tighter around his frame, his breath pluming in white clouds as he guided Sophie through the sliding slush. In his right hand, he gripped the thin, cheap plastic handles of their grocery bags, the meager yield of his careful penny pinching. He had managed to secure the absolute essentials: bread, peanut butter, some discounted soup, and in a rare moment of weakness, a heavy glass bottle of apple juice that Sophie had stared at just a second too long. It was a small luxury that had cost him his emergency bus fare, but seeing the quiet glimmer of gratitude in his daughter's eyes had made the sacrifice feel entirely worth it. The asphalt beneath their boots was a treacherous landscape of frozen puddles and black ice, concealed under a deceptive dusting of fresh snow. Every step required meticulous concentration. Ethan kept Sophie tucked close to his left side, using his body as a windbreak against the punishing gale. He instructed her to step exactly where he stepped, his voice muffled by the howling wind. She nodded silently, her small booted feet carefully tracing the heavy footprints he left in the snow. Despite the bitter cold, a profound sense of protective duty warmed Ethan's chest. He had stood up for a stranger in the store, a momentary lapse in his usual policy of keeping his head down and simply surviving. But his primary mission was always the quiet, observant girl clinging to his side. They were halfway to his battered, rusted sedan, parked under a flickering, dying halogen streetlight, when the harsh elements conspired against their fragile existence. It happened with a sudden, sickening sound, a sharp snap of overstressed plastic. The cheap grocery bag, made brittle by the freezing temperatures and strained by the weight of the glass bottle, completely gave way. Ethan lunged to catch it, but his freezing fingers grasped only empty, tearing plastic. A heavy, resounding crash shattered the frozen silence of the parking lot. The glass bottle of apple juice impacted the asphalt, exploding into 100 jagged shards. The golden liquid spilled across the ice, steaming faintly in the freezing air before rapidly beginning to freeze. A can of soup rolled away into the slush, and a loaf of bread tumbled onto the wet ground, its plastic wrapper insufficient to save it from the muddy runoff. Ethan let out a frustrated groan, a sound born of pure, bone-deep exhaustion. It wasn't just groceries. It was meals carefully calculated and now utterly ruined. Instinctively, despite her father's unspoken rule about letting him handle the heavy burdens, Sophie dropped to her knees to help salvage their ruined dinner. Ethan started to warn her about the broken glass, reaching out to pull her back, but the black ice was unforgiving. As she shifted her weight to reach for the rolling can of soup, her boot lost purchase on the slick, frozen surface. Her small body pitched forward violently. In a desperate attempt to catch her fall, Sophie threw her hands out toward the pavement. Ethan watched in a horrifying, slow-motion nightmare as her bare palm came down directly onto a large, viciously sharp shard of the shattered juice bottle. A gasp tore from Sophie's throat, followed immediately by a suffocating silence. She didn't scream or cry. The stoicism she had built as armor held firm, which somehow made the moment infinitely more terrifying for Ethan. He dropped the remaining bags, entirely abandoning the food they desperately needed, and fell to his knees beside her. When he gently pulled her trembling hand upward, his heart plummeted into his stomach. A deep, jagged laceration crossed the center of her small palm, and bright, crimson blood was already welling up, spilling over her fingers and dripping starkly onto the pristine white snow. Panic, primal and suffocating, seized Ethan's chest. He whipped off his frayed scarf, wrapping it tightly around her bleeding hand and applying firm, desperate pressure. Murmuring frantic assurances, he scooped her entirely into his arms, not sparing a single glance back at the scattered groceries. Holding his daughter tight against his chest, her small face buried in his shoulder, Ethan ran. He scrambled over the icy pavement, his lungs burning with the freezing air, until he reached his freezing car. He carefully buckled her into the back seat, his hands shaking violently as he locked the seatbelt over her silent, shivering frame. Tearing out of the parking lot, the tires spinning momentarily on the ice, he sped toward the brightly lit, sterile sanctuary of the nearby urgent care clinic. Every second felt like an hour as he navigated the slick streets, his eyes darting frantically between the road and the rearview mirror, praying for the bleeding to stop and the nightmare to end. The harsh fluorescent lights of the urgent care clinic buzzed overhead with a maddening, relentless hum, casting a sterile, sickly pallor over the sparsely populated waiting room. The air was thick with the sharp, clinical scent of rubbing alcohol and industrial floor cleaner, a stark contrast to the biting winter wind they had just escaped. Ethan sat rigidly on a stiff vinyl chair, his large frame hunched over his daughter protectively. Sophie was perched beside him, her small face alarmingly pale, though her jaw remained set in that familiar stoic line. Ethan's blood-soaked scarf was still wrapped tightly around her trembling hand, his own calloused fingers pressing firmly against the makeshift bandage. Every tick of the institutional clock on the wall felt like a physical blow, amplifying the gnawing anxiety in his chest. He scanned the room with bloodshot eyes, mentally calculating the agonizing wait time, his mind racing with fears of stitches, infections, and medical bills he simply could not afford to pay. Despite his rising panic, he kept his voice completely level, murmuring soft, meaningless reassurances into Sophie's ear, desperate to anchor her amidst the pain and the terrifying sterility of the clinic. As Ethan kept his eyes glued to the triage doors, waiting for a nurse to call their name, Sophie's gaze drifted across the bleak expanse of the waiting room. Despite the throbbing pain in her palm, her deeply observant nature remained acutely active. Across the aisle, sitting quietly with a battered magazine resting unread on her lap, was a familiar figure. It was the young woman from the grocery store, the stranger who had rushed to help the fallen elderly man. Under the unforgiving glare of the clinic lights, the fresh, blue-edged bruise on her left cheekbone looked even more jarring, a stark and violent shadow against her otherwise gentle features. She looked profoundly exhausted, staring blankly at the wall with a hollow expression that mirrored the weariness etched deeply into Ethan's own face. Sophie watched her for a long, silent moment, her dark eyes studying the woman's quiet grace and the undeniable sadness clinging to her shoulders. Then, with the pure, unshielded honesty that only young children possess, Sophie tugged weakly on the sleeve of Ethan's frayed coat. When he leaned down, expecting her to finally cry or complain about the agonizing pain, she instead buried her face into the crook of his neck. Her breath was hot against his freezing skin as she whispered a desire, so heartbreakingly simple and raw that it made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. "Daddy," she murmured softly, her eyes still locked on the bruised stranger across the room. "I want her to be my mom." The softly spoken words struck Ethan with the force of a physical blow, completely shattering his fragile composure. Before he could process the overwhelming weight of his daughter's secret yearning, the woman across the room, Clara Hayes, shifted her gaze and caught them staring. Recognition sparked instantly in her empathetic eyes. She saw the exhausted man who had bravely stood up for her in the produce aisle, and she immediately noticed the small, pale girl clutching a blood-soaked scarf. Without a moment of hesitation, Clara set her magazine aside and walked softly across the waiting room. She didn't approach with the loud, artificial cheer that most adults mistakenly used on frightened children. Instead, she brought a quiet, respectful presence, crouching down to Sophie's eye level with deliberate, unhurried movements. Clara intuitively understood the young girl's fiercely guarded nature. She didn't press or pry. Instead, she offered a warm, genuine smile that didn't quite reach the heavy sadness in her eyes. Speaking in a low, soothing cadence, Clara began to weave a gentle story about her own older brother, recounting a time he had foolishly tried to open a tin can with a pocketknife and ended up needing a dozen stitches. She described his comical panic and the ridiculous oversized bandage he had to wear, turning a scary medical situation into a relatable human moment. As Clara spoke, the rigid tension in Sophie's small shoulders finally began to melt away. The stoic mask she wore for her father's sake slipped, and she leaned infinitesimally closer to the soothing sound of Clara's voice. Even the trembling in her uninjured hand stilled. Seeing his daughter relax for the first time since the frozen parking lot, Ethan felt a massive, suffocating weight lift from his chest. Once Sophie closed her heavy eyes, lulled into a light doze by the sheer exhaustion of the evening and Clara's calming presence, Ethan and Clara finally locked eyes. They shared a quiet, unguarded conversation in the hushed tones of the waiting room. No grand declarations were made, and no probing questions were asked about the bruise on her cheek or the frayed edges of his clothes. Instead, they simply existed in that shared space, recognizing in each other the profound, echoing exhaustion of two people desperately trying to hold their fragile, breaking lives together. In the sterile, harsh glow of the clinic, amidst the smell of antiseptic and the lingering fear of the night, a quiet and unbreakable bond began to weave itself between them. The fragile, hesitant peace that had temporarily settled over the harsh, fluorescent geometry of the urgent care waiting room was violently ruptured when the heavy glass doors slid open, admitting a fresh, biting gust of the Chicago winter and the imposing figure of David Ross. The wealthy, arrogant man from the grocery store strode into the clinic with an aggressive sense of ownership, his pristine dark blue wool overcoat completely unmarred by the freezing storm raging outside, heavily contrasting with the frayed, damp clothing of the other exhausted patients. His sharp, calculating eyes swept the room with predatory efficiency until they locked onto Clara sitting quietly beside Ethan and the softly dozing Sophie. Instantly, David's face morphed, adopting a sickening mask of weaponized, artificial concern that made Ethan's stomach churn with disgust. He crossed the scuffed linoleum floor with heavy, deliberate steps, looming over Clara with a suffocating, possessive proximity. Ignoring Ethan completely, David reached out, his perfectly manicured fingers wrapping tightly around Clara's upper arm as he deployed a sickly sweet tone, insisting that she had caused enough of a public scene for one night and that it was time to come home. When Clara instinctively flinched, pulling her arm away from his painful grip, the polished facade slipped entirely, revealing the cold, calculating cruelty simmering just beneath the surface. His voice dropped to a harsh, venomous whisper, laced with aggressive, manipulative gaslighting, as he accused her of being hysterical, irrational, and fundamentally ungrateful. He seamlessly shifted the blame for the violent grocery store incident and the blooming bruise on her cheek onto her own supposed clumsiness and emotional instability, twisting the reality of the evening into a weapon against her. The toxic familiarity of his coercion hung heavy in the sterile air, a practiced, psychological routine designed to shrink Clara down until she was small enough to fit back into the suffocating, fearful box he had built for her. But as David tightened his jaw and reached for her again, demanding her immediate, unquestioning compliance, the dynamic in the small room fundamentally shifted. Ethan, who had been sitting in deep, protective silence, slowly stood up. Planting his warm boots firmly on the floor, he didn't raise his fists or shout. He simply unfolded his exhausted, broad-shouldered frame and positioned himself half a step forward, becoming an immovable wall of quiet, rugged defiance between Clara and her abuser. The silent, dangerous warning radiating from Ethan's dark, shadowed eyes was unmistakable, standing in stark contrast to David's hollow arrogance. At the exact same moment, the tense commotion roused little Sophie. Instead of shrinking away from the angry, towering man. The 8-year-old girl sat up straight in her hard plastic chair, fixing David with a fierce, unwavering, and intensely protective glare that perfectly mirrored her father's stoic resolve. Surrounded by this completely unexpected bulwark of support from two strangers, Clara felt the profound, paralyzing fear that had dictated her every move for years finally begin to fracture and break apart. The deep reservoir of strength she had been secretly rehearsing in the mirror for agonizing months surged to the surface, banishing her hesitation. She didn't scream or attempt to match his volatile aggression. Instead, she rose slowly to her feet, her posture straightening as she looked David dead in the eye for the first time in memory. With a voice that trembled for only a fraction of a second before solidifying into pure, resonant steel, Clara told him to take his hands off her. She calmly and methodically dismantled his gaslighting, stating clearly that she was not confused, she was not hysterical, and she would absolutely not be leaving with him, tonight or ever again. The words hung heavy in the quiet clinic, ringing with an undeniable, absolute finality. David's sharp features twisted in genuine, unadulterated shock, his weaponized charm completely neutralized by her newfound, immovable boundary. He glanced at the quietly menacing presence of Ethan, then down at the unwavering, accusatory stare of the young child, realizing with sudden, bitter clarity that his isolation tactics had spectacularly failed. The invisible chains of coercive control snapped definitively, leaving him powerless and exposed in the brightly lit room. Unable to tolerate the public loss of face, and realizing his absolute grip on her had vanished forever into the winter air, David sneered, spat a final, pathetic insult that fell completely flat against her armor, turned on his heel, and stormed out into the unforgiving snowy night. As the automatic doors hissed shut behind him, cutting off the howl of the wind, Clara sank back into her chair, her entire body trembling with the adrenaline of her liberation, finally free to breathe the sterile clinic air as a woman entirely her own. The adrenaline that had sustained Clara through the agonizing confrontation finally began to ebb, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion just as the clinic doors swung open and the weary doctor finally called Sophie's name. After a tense but remarkably smooth procedure with a stoic 8-year-old, bravely endured 5 neat stitches across her palm without a single tear, the trio emerged back into the brutal, unforgiving grip of the Chicago winter. With David's toxic presence gone, but Clara now suddenly untethered and in desperate need of a safe haven, Ethan didn't hesitate to offer her a ride to a trusted friend's house across the city. Clara accepted with a quiet nod of profound gratitude, following the exhausted single father and his bandaged daughter to a battered, rust-eaten sedan tucked away in the darkest corner of the icy parking lot. As the heavy doors slammed shut against the howling gale, the interior of the drafty car offered only a marginal reprieve from the bitter cold, smelling faintly of stale French fries and aged upholstery. Ethan turned the ignition, the engine sputtering and coughing in protest before finally catching with a rattling hum, the broken heater fighting a losing battle against the frost creeping up the windshield. The snowy drive through the desolate, neon-lit streets was enveloped in a profound, comfortable silence, a stark contrast to the oppressive, suffocating tension that Clara had lived with for years. Eventually, the quiet was gently broken by a candid, deeply vulnerable exchange between the two weary adults, their voices low so as not to wake the exhausted child sleeping in the back. Clara stared out at the passing streetlights, blurring through the falling snow, confessing the deep, lingering pain of trying to trust your own reality after being chronically gaslit and mentally dismantled by someone who claimed to love you. Ethan listened with an unwavering, empathetic stillness, his large, calloused hands gripping the worn steering wheel as he offered quiet validation, acknowledging the sheer terror of having the ground constantly shifted beneath your feet. He didn't offer hollow platitudes or magical solutions. He simply held the space for her truth, his steady presence acting as a grounding anchor in the storm of her newfound freedom. When Ethan finally pulled up to the curb of a modest, brightly lit townhouse nestled in a quiet, snow-blanketed neighborhood, the gentle hum of the idling engine roused a half-asleep Sophie from the back seat. Blinking heavily, she peered over the frayed fabric of the front seat and, with that same unshielded, childish earnestness she had shown in the clinic, pleaded softly for Clara to stay with them instead of going inside. The innocent, heartfelt request hung in the chilly air for a heartbeat before sparking a sudden, entirely unguarded laugh from Clara. It wasn't the polite, measured chuckle she used to navigate tense social situations. It was a bright, genuine, and deeply unburdened sound that seemed to fundamentally shift the very air in the cold, cramped car, carrying the weightless resonance of pure liberation. Ethan felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth blossom in his chest at the sound, a stark contrast to the relentless chill of his daily existence. There was no magical fairy tale resolution that night, no sudden erasure of their respective struggles. Clara still had to open the passenger door, step out into the freezing snow, and walk into her friend's house to begin the grueling, terrifying work of rebuilding her shattered life from the ground up. Ethan still had to shift the rusty sedan back into drive and steer through the muffled, treacherous snow back to a drafty, impoverished apartment with a ruined grocery budget and a wounded child. Yet, as Ethan watched Clara wave from the warm porch light before disappearing safely inside, and as he glanced in the rearview mirror at his brave daughter sleeping peacefully in the back, he felt a profound seismic shift in the universe. Armed with nothing but the memory of a brave stranger's name and the echoing warmth of her real, unbroken laugh, the struggling father realized that while their grueling reality hadn't magically vanished, a quiet, incredibly durable spark of hope had finally been ignited in the deepest, darkest winter of their lives.